Mr. Luckman and I welcome you to another discussion of the great ideas. Today, as we continue with the discussion of opinion, we shall try to push further our understanding of the difference between knowing and opining. Now, there are a number of questions we ought to answer, or ought to consider at least. First, what sort of objects are the objects of knowledge? Can we have knowledge about, as opposed to the objects about which we can only have opinion? Second, what is the psychological difference between knowing and opining as acts of the mind? Third, can we have knowledge and opinion about one and the same thing? And finally, a fourth question, what is the scope of knowledge? How much knowledge do we really have? And as opposed to the kinds of things about which we can only have opinion. What is the limit or scope of opinion in the things of our mind? Now, these are the questions we're going to try to answer as we proceed today.
There's one more, Dr. Adler. Unless somehow you've included it in these 4 questions that you've already outlined.
What's that? What do you have in mind, Mr. Luckman?
My question about religion. You recall last time when you made the point about liberty of conscience, it caused me to ask you whether you thought that freedom of conscience gave a person the right to his own opinion in matters of religion. And if you do think so, then I also want to know whether you think that in matters of religious belief and religious faith, that they are then simply matters of opinion rather than knowledge.
Well, we shall certainly have to face that question, Mr. Luckman, as we proceed today. I didn't mention it specifically because in my enumeration of questions, because in a sense it's contained in my 4th question, the question about how much knowledge do we have. Of course, as we draw the line between the sphere of knowledge on the one hand and the sphere of opinion, we should have to place mathematics and the experimental sciences and philosophy and history either on one side or the other side of the line, and therefore we have to place religion one place or the other also. Before we begin to look for an answer to that question and these other questions, as a matter of fact, I would like to develop a little further. I would like to develop a little further the educational implications of a point that we discussed last time. It concerns knowledge and opinion in relation to the truth. We saw last time that knowledge is always true. You can't have false knowledge, but that opinion may be either true or false. Now let's use the phrase right opinion to signify any opinion which happens as a matter of fact to be true. Then we must ask the question, what is the difference between knowledge and right opinion? Since both are true, since truth is involved in both cases, how do they differ? And I think we began to see the answer last time. When you have truth through knowledge, you not only have the truth, but you understand why it is true. But when you have the truth through having only a right opinion, you may have the truth in fact, but you will not understand why it is true. Now, let me introduce 2 other terms into our discussion: error and ignorance. Everyone knows, I'm sure, that when one is in error or one is ignorant, one does not have the truth. Then how do they differ? Well, they differ as follows. The person who is in error not only lacks the truth, but does not know that he does not know. On the contrary, he supposes that he does know. Whereas the person who is ignorant lacks the truth and in addition knows that he does not know. Let me show you the relation of these 4 things: knowledge, right opinion, error, and ignorance in a chart. The relation is very interesting. Knowledge is to right opinion on the side of truth, as ignorance is to error on the side of lack of truth. Perhaps I can say this more fully in the words that are below here. The understood truth, which is knowledge, is to the not understood truth, which is right opinion, as the understood lack of truth, which is ignorance, is to the misunderstood lack of truth, which is error.
You know, Dr. Adler, I find your chart a most interesting device for distinguishing between knowledge and opinion. In fact, the thing that I like to think about, too, is that I wonder how many people have thought about this problem just this way before. And impressing me is the ratio there where, as you read it, ignorance becomes more like knowledge and error more like opinion. And I wonder, too, if the chart isn't saying that it's better to be in ignorance than in error.
That's precisely what the chart suggests, Mr. Luckman. And I suspect that when I say this, when I say that ignorance is more like knowledge than error is, some of you may think it's a shocking mistake to suppose so. But though this may seem paradoxical, I think I can explain to you why it is so. Any teacher will tell you that it's much easier to teach a student who is ignorant than one who is in error. Because the student who is in error on a given point thinks that he knows, whereas in fact he does not know. The student who is ignorant is in a much better condition to learn. It is almost necessary to take the student who is in error and first correct the error before you can teach him. That's what I think that's the meaning of saying that error is further away from knowledge than ignorance is. The path from ignorance to knowledge is a shorter path than the path from error to knowledge, because if a person is error, you must first get rid of the error and reduce him to ignorance before you can start teaching him. Now, Socrates was the first teacher to discover this principle of teaching and to apply it in practice. He applied it all the time. His method was the first principle of his method. His method was to go about, as he said himself, cross-examining the pretenders to knowledge and wisdom. And by the cross-examination, showing them that they were in error, that what they supposed they knew, they did not know. Thus, first reducing them to ignorance, so that they could be in the right state of mind to inquire and to learn. This technique of Socrates was a very annoying technique. And that, combined with the fact that he was very fond of saying ironically that his only wisdom consisted in his knowing that he didn't know, in his acknowledging his ignorance, so infuriated his fellow citizens that they put him to death. Now, as we go on to explore the psychological difference between knowing and opining as acts of the mind, I think we will see some further educational implications of this distinction between knowledge and opinion. I would like to begin by recalling to you two insights, one that we find in Plato and one that we find in Aristotle. The Greeks, particularly Plato and Aristotle, were very much concerned about this matter of the difference between knowledge and opinion. Plato tells us that knowledge, and only knowledge, is teachable. Right opinion is not teachable because it is not founded in reasons, it has no principles, it has no roots or grounds in things from which it can be demonstrated. Most of the things that children learn in school are right opinion, not knowledge. All one has to do, I suppose, is to recall how one learns history or geography. These things, being right opinion, can only be learned by a kind of memorization. Compare that with the teaching or learning of geometry, which really can be taught and learned in a rational manner, because such truth as is there rests in principles and in the demonstration of conclusions. Now, Aristotle's point is that, or his insight on this subject is that one man can opine about what another man knows. They can be thinking of the same thing, but whereas the one man merely has an opinion, the other man can have knowledge on that very same subject. Let me see if I can illustrate this for you by an example from geometry. I have here the diagram in Euclid, taken from Euclid, that represents the famous Pythagorean theorem. The theorem is that the square on the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. Now, the teacher who knows the demonstration of this conclusion in geometry understands why it is true and therefore has knowledge of this proposition. But the student who, repeating the words of the Pythagorean theorem and then being asked, why is that true, says, because my professor told me, doesn't have knowledge of this truth, but only has a right opinion of it because he's holding it on the authority of his teacher and in that way alone. Now, what this tells us is that when anyone argues from authority, when anyone holds an opinion or holds a position, says something is true on authority and authority alone, he's holding it as a matter of opinion. And whenever a teacher appeals to his authority to persuade the students to believe something, he isn't teaching them. He's really only indoctrinating them. He's forming right opinions in their minds.
You know, Dr. Adler, as I listen to you, I wonder really how much teaching, that is, actual imparting of knowledge, actually does go on in our schools and colleges. Just how many subjects, then, are there in the curriculum which are teachable? And by that I mean matters about which the students can actually obtain knowledge.
Well, that's a very hard question to answer, Mr. Luckman. A good one, but a hard one. And we may find some answer to it when presently we draw the line that divides the realm of knowledge from the realm of opinion. But before we do that, let's see if we can understand the thing we've been leading up to, just what the psychological difference is between the act of knowing and the act of opining. Let me state it for you quickly at once. We opine when the assent of our minds is voluntary. We know when the assent we give to something is involuntary. Now, that statement may not come clear at once. Let me illustrate it. If I say to you, is this true? Is it true that 2 plus 2 equals 4? You don't make up your mind. If you think about this, what you're thinking about makes up your mind for you. Let me show you that one other way. I hold up 2 cigarettes. I hold up 2 more cigarettes. 2 cigarettes and 2 cigarettes, and I bring them together. And I ask you the question, are there 4 cigarettes here? Can you give me the answer no? You cannot. You aren't free to. You are compelled by what you're looking at to say, yes, the answer is 4. That shows it is knowledge. But if I ask you to consider this other statement that we've been using as an example of opinion, the statement itself doesn't compel you to say yes or no. You can say either yes or no. The statement leaves you quite free to make up your own mind. And because it leaves you quite free, either on authority or because of your desires or your interests or your emotions or your passions, anything, to make up your own mind, this is psychologically an act of opinion on your part, not an act of knowledge. Now, perhaps I ought to summarize this for you in a very careful statement of the psychological difference of knowledge and opinion. And I can do that for you in this chart I'm going to show you now. Let's read this carefully together because this is a summary statement. A statement expresses knowledge when our assent to it is involuntary, when our assent to it is compelled or necessitated by the object we are thinking about, as in the case of 2 plus 2 equals 4. But a statement expresses opinion, not knowledge, when our assent to it is voluntary, when the object leaves us quite free to make up our own minds to think this way or that way about the object, to think about the object exactly as we please. And usually, in the case of opinion, what makes up our mind, one way or the other, is not the thing we're thinking about, but our emotions, our desires, our interests, or some authority upon which we are relying. Thus, you can see that the nature of opinion is, to use a contemporary phrase, is wishful thinking. It is an exercise of the will to believe. And when one is holding mere opinion, one finds the emotional content very high indeed. Precisely in proportion as the opinion is not well founded in fact or evidence, one tends to support it with one's emotions and to be obstinate in holding on to it as one holds on to a prejudice. I know this in my own case. When I find that I'm saying, no, that is not so, that isn't so, I'm sure I'm right about that, with emphasis and great force, I suspect that I'm holding an opinion without much evidence to support it, and that I'm putting into my emotions making up by my emotions the lack of evidence. Now, I think, Mr. Luckman, this has a bearing on your last question about teaching. Many of the things taught in school may not be knowledge in the strict sense, but if they are not mere opinion in this sense, if they are well-founded opinions that have probabilities resting on the evidence, and moreover, if the teacher appeals to the intellect of the student, weighing the evidences, weighing the probabilities, and does not merely appeal to his own authority to persuade the student, then he is teaching them in a very genuine sense, even if it's only opinion rather than knowledge. But on the other hand, if the teacher appeals to the emotions of the student and heavily relies upon his own authority to persuade them, then he isn't teaching them, but indoctrinating them. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, in part it does answer my question, Dr. Adler, but I'd still like to know how much of what is learned in school is really knowledge in the stricter sense. That is, opposed to the very best sort of opinion, as you've been putting it, this highly probable, based on evidence, and et cetera.
Well, let's see if we can find the answer to that question. But matter of fact, I ought to say, Mr. Luckman, not let's see if we can find the answer to that question, but let's see if we can find the answers to that question, because there are two answers to that question. One given by the skeptic, the man who thinks that there's very little knowledge, the other given by the opponent of the skeptic, the man who thinks that there's considerably more knowledge. Let me start out with the skeptical view and begin by stating the position of a man who in modern times represents the extreme of skepticism. That man is the French essayist Montaigne. Montaigne really says that we know nothing. Everything is a matter of opinion. And we mustn't be fooled, he says, by the feeling which we sometimes have of certainty, that the thing is perfectly clear and sure for us. The argument the skeptic uses against the persons who say, well, I feel certain about that, to show them that they ought to be certain, are the illusions. The familiar argument comes from the illusions of the senses, perceptual illusions. Let me show you some of these to have you have the experience the skeptic wants you to have. Look at these two diagrams. Doesn't this top rhomboid look larger than the bottom one? It isn't. Look at these two lines, the horizontal line and the vertical line. Doesn't the vertical line look longer than the horizontal line? It isn't. They're the same length. Look here at these circles, and look particularly at that circle, the inner circle in this case, and the inner circle in this case. Doesn't this circle look larger than this circle? But it isn't. And finally, look at these two pairs of lines. That line enclosed by the arrows pointed in, this line enclosed by the arrows, or ended by the arrows pointed out. Doesn't this line look shorter than this line? But it isn't. They're both of the same length. Now, a more moderate skepticism is that of the Scotch philosopher David Hume. David Hume took the position that we do have some knowledge. Our knowledge consists in sciences like mathematics, where we do begin with axioms or self-evident truths and are able to demonstrate conclusions. But Hume, this is all the knowledge we have. In all of history, in all of the experimental sciences, we have only, according to Hume, at best, highly probable opinion. Let me read you Hume's famous statement that summarizes this point. I have here a volume of Hume. And this statement, by the way, easy to mark because it comes at the very end of his essay or his enquiry concerning human understanding. He says, he asked the question, if we take any volume in our library, here's a library, take any volume in our hand, let us ask, he says, does it contain any abstract reasoning about quantity or number? That is it a work in mathematics? Or let us ask, does it contain any experimental reasoning about matters of fact or real existence? That is it a work in experimental science? If the answer is no, then he says, commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Now, what is he saying in this very famous passage? He's saying that only in mathematics do we have the certitude of knowledge. And that we have such certitude only when we're thinking about the relations between our own ideas, our own concepts. Whereas in regard to all matters of fact or real existence, we have experimental reasoning. And this, according to Hume, is at best probable. And because it's probable, it is opinion, not knowledge, even though it's highly probable, evidence supported opinion. For Hume, everything else, which is not experimental science or mathematics, is worse than that. And he puts philosophy here. It is sheer opinion, not even probable opinion, mere superstition or prejudice. Now, in our day, we have gone, I think, even further toward the skeptical extreme than Hume went. Because in our day, with our knowledge of the non-Euclidean geometries, we tend now to doubt that even mathematics is knowledge. Because the mathematical systems, like the systems of Euclid and other non-Euclidean geometries, seem to be based upon postulates or assumptions, and so seem to require us to begin with a belief, something accepted on faith, rather than with clear, self-evident principles. I have a letter in my file, if I can find it, on this subject that I'd like to read you. Man writes that even 2 plus 2 equals 4, he says, only if you assume certain things. And he goes on to say that mathematics is simply a man-made system of logic, consistent with itself. And therefore, in view of this, he wants to know whether mathematics should properly be called knowledge. And if you call mathematics knowledge, he says, then is any body of statements based on certain assumptions and consistently developed therefrom knowledge? And my answer to that question is no. If mathematics were only based on assumptions and nothing else, on postulates rather than axioms, then I would say it was opinion, not knowledge. Now, what is the answer to the skeptic? Let me begin. I've stated the skeptic's position. Let me now give the answer to the skeptic. First of all, most important of all, the answer to the skeptic on the matter of perceptual illusions. How do we know they are illusions? If we know there are illusions, we can only know it because some sense perceptions we regard as accurate. If we could not have some verified or clear and acceptable perceptions, we couldn't know these were illusions. Let me show you that. Let me take the last of these perceptual illusions and put this ruler down. And as I put the ruler down, I see that that's 12 1/4 inches, and I put it down here again and see that it's 12 1/4 inches. If this perception were not knowledge, I couldn't call that an illusion. If this perception were an illusion, I couldn't know that was an illusion. Hence, to even discover that there are perceptual illusions, I have to know by perception. And then with regard to mathematics, the opponent of the skeptic answers by saying, I think quite rightly in this case, that mathematics is not based only on assumptions, but upon axioms, self-evident truths. And that not only mathematics, but metaphysics and other branches of philosophical science are knowledge in the same sense. As for history and experimental science, the opponent of the skeptic is likely to agree with him on this point, that these subjects are not knowledge, but highly probable opinion. In fact, he might say that experimental science is a kind of conditional knowledge, conditional upon the state of the evidence at a given time. And finally, one final reply to the skeptic is this, that the skeptic, particularly when he's an extreme skeptic and says that everything is a matter of opinion, he can't argue for his case. He can't defend his case, for if he would try to prove his point, he would establish that something was knowledge and so defeat himself. Now I think, Mr. Luckman, you have some indication, at least, of the two leading answers, the two opposed answers to your question about what is taught in school, about how much of it is strictly knowledge and how much of it is only probable opinion.
Well, I like these answers, but I still think I'll have to think about them just a little bit more in order that I can apply the answers and see how they work out in practice and actually affect our teaching. But you still haven't answered my question, the question about religion. How about it? Religion, matters of faith, are they knowledge or opinion?
Let me see if I can answer that question now in the closing moments of today's discussion. There are two views of religious faith. One, held by William James, is that religious faith is an act of the will to believe, and this act of the will to believe takes place when we are beyond the evidence or the evidence insufficient. And so, according to James, religious faith is strictly opinion. On the other hand, there's the position of Aquinas that religious belief or faith is an act of the will. He agrees with James so far, but it's an act of the will wherein the will is itself moved by a supernatural gift of grace from God. Faith is a gift of grace, and therefore, according to Aquinas, faith isn't knowledge, but neither is it opinion. It is something in between knowledge and opinion. Shall I read you the passages in which what Aquinas has to say on this subject?
I'd very much like to hear it. From which of his works are you selecting the passage?
This comes from the treatise on faith, hope, and charity.
Oh, yes.
And this is the very beginning of the treatise on faith. The passage that I'm relying on reads as follows. Aquinas says, the intellect assents to a thing in two ways. First, through being moved to assent by its very object, which is known either by itself, as in the case of first principles or axioms, or through something else already known, as in the case of demonstrating conclusions. In either case, says Aquinas, you have knowledge, not opinion. But secondly, Aquinas says, the intellect assents to something not through being sufficiently moved to assent by its proper object, but through an active choice, whereby it voluntarily turns to one side rather than the other. And if this be accompanied by doubt and by fear of the opposite, then you'll have opinion. While if there be certainty and no fear of the opposite, then there will be faith. And this certainty of faith, Aquinas explains, results from the fact that it is supernatural, it is a gift of God. For he says, since man, by ascending to matters of faith, is raised above his nature, this must needs accrue to him from some supernatural principle, moving him inwardly. And this is God. Therefore, faith, as regards the assent, which is the chief act of faith, is from God, moving man inwardly by grace. And that is why Aquinas says that faith is neither knowledge nor opinion, but something intermediate between them, like them in both respects.
I'm sorry, but I don't quite see how it's like them both. In what way is it like them?
Well, on the one hand, Mr. Luckman, faith is like opinion in that it's an act of the will, rather than an act based upon the thing in its own terms. That's why St. Paul defines faith as the evidence of things unseen, not seen directly or known in their own terms. On the other hand, faith is like knowledge because of the certitude it has, a certitude that is even greater than the certitude of ordinary knowledge because it rests upon the supernatural gift of grace. Now this concludes our discussion of the difference between knowledge and opinion and of the scope of each in human life, the realm of opinion and the realm of knowledge. Next time as we go on, I hope we can deal with some of the practical problems concerning opinion. Such problems as the relation of opinion to human freedom, the institutions of government, the opposition between majority and minority opinions. I hope that this subject continues to interest you and that you'll be with us again as we continue it next time. Thank you very much.